You're listening to The Globalist, first broadcast on the 23rd of October 2024 on Monocle Radio. The Globalist in association with UBS. Live from London, this is The Globalist with me, Emma Nelson. A very warm welcome to today's programme. Coming up.
I believe very much that the death of Sinwar does create an important opportunity to bring the hostages home, to bring the war to an end, and to ensure Israel's security.
With less than 2 weeks to go before the US presidential elections, the Biden administration dispatches teams to Israel and Ukraine. We'll ask what can be achieved with this last-minute diplomacy before time risks running out. Also coming up, the latest UN Biodiversity Summit opens in Colombia. We'll examine what's at stake. Plus,
today, the RTS malaria vaccine, more than 30 years in the making, changes the course of public health history.
3 years ago, the World Health Organization announced a vaccine for malaria. Now Egypt is declared free of the disease. Will mark a positive milestone in global public health. Plus, we'll hear the latest transport headlines, go through the papers and head to Rome for the film festival there. That's all coming up on The Globalist, live from London. First, to look at what else is happening in today's news. Donald Trump's presidential campaign has filed a legal complaint against Britain's governing Labour Party, accusing it of interfering in the US election. Ukraine's Prosecutor General has resigned following a scandal in which dozens of officials reportedly abused their positions to avoid military service. And one of the world's richest people, Bill Gates, has reportedly donated $50 million to a non-profit organisation that supports Kamala Harris's presidential bid. Stay tuned to Monocle Radio throughout the day for more on these stories. But first, as the Biden administration draws to a close, Washington is embarking on a furious campaign of last-minute diplomacy. The US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, is in Israel, while the Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin has been in Kyiv this week. What can they do in less than a fortnight that hasn't been achieved in the last 12 months, and in the case of Ukraine, nearly 3 years? Well, to tell us more, I'm joined now by Natasha Linstead, Professor of Government at the University of Essex. A very good morning. Welcome back, Natasha.
Good morning.
So just to outline again, we'll do Antony Blinken's trip to Israel first. What was the purpose of this? He held a 2.5 hour meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu.
I think the U.S. At this point, the Biden administration has been working around the clock to get a ceasefire. A ceasefire would, of course, be a huge win. But there are several other purposes of this particular visit. One was to try to ensure that Israel would allow for more humanitarian aid to get to Gaza, particularly in the north, where the U.S. is particularly concerned that Israel doesn't want to provide any aid to anyone in Gaza and actually wants to just force all the Gazans out of the northern part of Gaza. And the other thing is that there's more pressure for a permanent ceasefire and discussions about how is Gaza going to be governed? What is the end game here? And so they were trying to capitalize on the recent death of Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar, who was considered to be one of the more extremist members of Hamas and who would have been a holdout in any kind of truce or deal. But I think this is really wishful thinking. Netanyahu has made it clear that the war isn't going to end anytime soon and that they want to eliminate Hamas. And that's basically what Netanyahu said, that this isn't going to be over until Hamas is completely eliminated. And for Hamas's standpoint, they want a permanent truce, a permanent ceasefire, a prisoner exchange before any hostages are going to be released.
It was astonishing, wasn't it, the reports that Israel and the United States gave of this meeting with Netanyahu and between Netanyahu and Blinken. It almost felt as if it was two different occasions, because we had Blinken saying we need to capitalise on the death of Sinwar in Gaza. We need to see what we could do to bring about an end to this conflict, to bring the hostages home. The Israelis gave a completely different summary. They talked about the threat from Iran and the need to join forces.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the things that you've been seeing between the U.S. and Israel, though they've been longtime allies, really staunch allies for decades. They do not have coinciding interest to the same degree as they did anymore. In fact, at this point, they have completely different interests. If we were just to look politically speaking, Blinken is urgently trying to get a ceasefire. This will have a huge impact on the election. It really will impact the state of Michigan, where Arab Americans have been very clear that they would not vote for Harris or continuation of the Biden administration without a ceasefire. But also just more generally, there has been just complete disapproval and horror with the way Israel has waged the war in Gaza, that there's just been such a terrible humanitarian crisis that unfolded, which the U.S. felt was not necessary, that it could have been avoided, though Israel has the right to defend itself, that it did not need to go about it in this way. Whereas Israel is incredibly focused on escalating the war because they want to eliminate their enemies. They want to eliminate Hezbollah, Hamas, and they want to really weaken Iran by getting Iran involved in the conflict as well.
Plus, Benjamin Netanyahu wants Trump to win. So one wonders whether this last-minute push of diplomacy actually has any purpose other than to send a message back to those voters unsure as to whether they will go for Kamala Harris, that there is a sense of commitment from any prospective Democrat administration.
Right. So from this administration, they are trying that last-ditch effort. I think they were really motivated after Yahya Sinwar was assassinated. They thought this was really an opportunity, but there's no chance of a ceasefire. There's no chance of anything really significant happen because, as you mentioned, Netanyahu wants Trump to win. He feels he can manipulate Trump more easily and then have more free reign to do what he wants to do, both in Lebanon and in Iran. But what they are trying to do, in the U.S. at least, is trying to get more humanitarian aid into northern Gaza. And that's what Antony Blinken highlighted, this letter that was sent by the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, saying that military aid will be withheld unless Israel allows for more humanitarian aid to go in. Because actually there is a law that the U.S. is not allowed to support any country provided with any kind of military aid if it is obstructing the delivery of humanitarian aid.
And as a result, I mean, what's the time frame for this one? We know that the clock is ticking. We know that that letter was sent more than a week ago in the full knowledge that I think it gave a 30-day deadline for the Israelis to do this, with the prospect that actually that deadline might happen after the next administration is voted.
That's right. So it could have no political impact, let's just say, on the election. But the Biden administration, of course, will be in power for the rest of the year. So they're trying to use their leverage to get some kind of impact. They were able to get humanitarian aid and like sort of a brief ceasefire or truce to deliver the humanitarian aid back in April when they had sent a similarly threatened message to Israel about the importance of doing this. But I think you can see that in this relationship, the U.S. does not have that much leverage because there are already pre-existing plans in place that seem to keep delivering large amounts of military aid to Israel, no matter what Israel does. There was just recently $20 billion in weapons that was sent to Israel by the U.S. So these are really mixed messages. If you're going to try to get another country to do what it wants to do, you can't send them weapons while then scolding them at the same time.
Now let's move on to an area where the U.S. does have more leverage, which is Ukraine and its battle against Russia. We have Lloyd Austin and Volodymyr Zelensky meeting each other, shaking hands, usual good-natured photographs. This happened in the last couple of days, and Volodymyr Zelensky wrote on the social media afterwards that they talked about everything, especially the use of long-range strike capabilities against Russian military targets. It is a well-worn path that Zelensky's going down here. Did he get anywhere with Lloyd Austin?
Oh, I don't know if you could say that he got anywhere about that. I mean, the Biden administration has been really worried about that conflict spilling over and somehow the U.S. or Western forces are more directly involved. I think what what the U.S. was trying to do with this meeting was to give assurances that at least the Biden administration will support Ukraine and is very loyal in its support, and that this is not going to waver. But of course, Zelensky knows that if Harris doesn't win the election, there's going to be a change of administration that will be very significant, because Trump has made it clear that he sees Zelensky and Putin as equals. He mentioned in front of Zelensky that it takes two to tango, that Putin was one of his friends as well. And so I think Zelensky knows that there's time running out here. So he's probably trying to pressure Lloyd Austin to deliver more, while understanding with this election being so close that there will be a huge change in the amount of aid that the U.S. is going to be willing to provide Ukraine if Trump is elected.
And just looking back at what Lloyd Austin has done, a senior defense official at the White House said that one of the purposes of Austin's visit was to serve as a moment for him to look at the arc of the US-Ukraine relationship over the last 2.5 years, but also to see the way that America, in this case, not in the case of Israel, but in this case, has seen multinational coalitions as a key aspect of what he wants his legacy as defense secretary to be.
Yeah, that's right, because the Trump administration was very unilateral in the way that it behaved. It wasn't focused on diplomacy and had really rejected any kind of multilateral cooperation. That was something that the Biden administration was trying to rebuild back, both through Austin's work as Secretary of Defense, I should say, and Antony Blinken's work as Secretary of State. They were hoping that these coalitions would endure, that the allies and partners that they have built, and that Austin said that he had been proud of, to watch this pro-Ukraine coalition dig incredibly deep. They're hoping that this would be more enduring, and that appeared to be part of what, as you mentioned, would be the legacy here. And so they're trying to project confidence and say that U.S. support will continue, and that every day, I'm quoting here, that they're building a long-term capability to Ukraine. So that's what I think he's hoping his legacy is.
Natasha Lindstedt from the University of Essex, thank you as ever for joining us on Monocle Radio. You are the Globalist. It's 7:12 a.m. here in London, 1 a.m. in 12 a.m. I should say, in Cali, Colombia, which is where we head next, because we are now going to hear about the Global Biodiversity Framework. COP16. It's an event considered to be one of the world's most important moments to conserve biodiversity. It's taking place in Colombia. Some 15,000 people are expected at COP16, including a dozen heads of state and more than 1,000 of the world's media. Well, to tell us more, I'm joined now by Anna Turns, who's Senior Environment Editor at The Conversation. A very warm welcome. Good morning, Anna.
Hi, Emma. Thanks for having me.
The purpose of this meeting is what? Could you outline it for us, please?
So this meeting happens every 2 years, and this year, particularly in Cali, Colombia, the purpose is to measure progress. One of our authors, Callum Roberts, the Professor of Marine Conservation at Exeter, describes COP16 as a biannual pulse-taking of the living planet, where actions to protect the natural world are agreed. So basically, decisions are made, but this year particularly, it's all about action, and it's about meeting those targets. And those targets so far are not being met. A lot of the targets are about halting and reversing biodiversity loss by 2030. That's only 5 and a bit years away. And we haven't done enough yet to really get going.
Indeed, there's the Global Biodiversity Framework has more than 20, about 23 targets that it has to meet by 2030. You say the likelihood of these targets being met are not high, but how close could we get?
Hopefully a lot closer, but a lot needs to happen. Rather than just thinking about the targets, thinking about how we're going to reach those targets more specifically a lot more needs to happen to make that a reality, basically. So one of the biggest sticking points is finance. Who's going to pay for all of these solutions? Who's going to actually make this happen? Which countries are going to contribute, et cetera, et cetera. And actually, really interestingly, I spoke to Harriet Bulkley, a professor of geography at Durham last night, who is at COP. And she said that in the side events and in the pavilions at the at the conference, the number of sessions focusing on finance is an order of magnitude, she says, different from previous COPs. So there's whole days dedicated to finance, business, nature tech, all of these things. And so that is a really, really big step up. Obviously, that's really important because we want to mobilise a society-wide response to the nature crisis and come at it from all angles, whether it's business or community or government. But obviously, it's not just about the private sector. It's about activating public money and government investment as well. So it's coming at it from all angles. I think there's definitely more consciousness of that this year, which is really, really brilliant. But still, we've got a long way to go. Just explain to us, Hannah, what the fight against biodiversity looks like. What needs to be done practically? A lot. and I think one of the things that people often forget is that biodiversity loss is so intrinsically linked to climate change. So biodiversity loss, the number of species going extinct is sort of happening rapidly. Yes, that's really sad, but it's also really bad for us. We live on this planet. We need a healthy ecosystem to function properly. So what a lot of these scientists and experts and conservationists who are discussing this at COP16 this week are talking about is ecosystem services. And these are the things that nature basically provides us for free when it's healthy. So things like food, things like clean water, all of these natural things that happen that we can take advantage of. Not that we should just take advantage of nature. We obviously need to support it as well. But these ecosystem services have real value. And so, for example, if we didn't have any earthworms, we wouldn't have healthy soils. We would find it harder to grow nutritious food, and that would impact human life. So I think there's a lot at stake here. It's not just, we don't need to only think about climate change in terms of extreme weather events, floods, hurricanes, disasters, kind of heat waves in the future, now and in the future, but actually biodiversity loss is really, really critical and actually really alarming. So talk to us about the main players here. I mean, where are the areas of agreement and who is leading the charge here, and where are those sticking points coming and who's objecting? So in terms of the areas of agreement, there is a lot being discussed about finance, obviously, as I've said. Biopiracy is another aspect that a lot of countries are really, really keen to sort out. So biopiracy is basically the unethical appropriation of biological resources. So when a big pharmaceutical company takes genetic information from a rare Amazonian plant and makes a new drug from it, for example, who owns that genetic code? There's a lot of debate happening, particularly this week and next week, about how best to channel funding into protecting valuable biological resources like this. So basically, if this is done properly, we can better protect the genetic information, but also the people in those places and the places themselves, the nature where those genetic resources are coming from can be better protected. So that is a really, really fascinating one. There's a lot up for negotiation there. And it could help generate a huge amount of finance. And who's resisting the most against this? I mean, we saw a referendum in Switzerland a couple of weeks ago where biodiversity and the use of land was actually outright rejected by the population. It's really tricky. I mean, there's 196 different countries and bodies at this event. Nobody's doing it brilliantly, I have to say. At the moment, only a handful of countries are contributing to what we call the Global Biodiversity Framework Fund, which was established last year. That's Germany, UK, Canada, Japan, and Spain. But I have to say that in terms of countries that are most resistant, not specifically to biopiracy, but to all of this biodiversity action, only a handful, I think about 25 countries, and that includes China, Canada, France, have submitted their new national biodiversity plans, which this basically shows how they will achieve the promises that were made 2 years ago at the last COP in Montreal, Canada. Most of the countries out of the 196, so 170-ish, and that includes the UK, so about 80% of those countries haven't submitted their full plans. They were delayed in doing that before this COP. And that tells me that not enough countries are engaged, and there is kind of an underlying resistance, basically.
And you were talking about Montreal there and how much progress has or has not been made. I mean, how much are people realistically hoping to achieve? Because UN meetings do, dare I say it, have the tendency to have the same people on the same panel saying the same things and having the same photographs taken in a different location. I mean, is there a sense that COP16 could be different?
So I get the sense, I'm not there, I'm in the UK at the moment, but I get the sense in talking to a lot of our experts and academics at universities who are there and on the ground, that actually one of the key themes of this particular COP is diversifying voices and giving a platform for more young people, more women, more local and indigenous communities. There's a really big push to recognise ancestral rights of indigenous people. And I think that need to have more diverse voices kind of on the platform and on stage is absolutely beneficial. We don't just want white men in suits. We want a kind of mix of ideas. We want a mix of views. We want all of these issues to be discussed from every possible angle, and that will enrich the possibilities and the progress, I think. From what I've heard from the people I've spoken to, I am hopeful that that's happening. Obviously, always more can be done. But I do think things are starting to shift. And I think people are starting to value the fact that there is so much knowledge that we aren't maybe taking notice of. And actually, we need to give everyone an equal chance to say their piece.
Anna Turns, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. Still to come on today's programme.
Now, from visionary writer and director Francis Ford Coppola, comes an event nothing can prepare you for.
That was, as we understand, an excerpt from Francis Ford Coppola's Megalopolis there. The director's among those being honoured at the Rome International Film Festival this week and will be in the Italian capital to hear more a little later. So stay tuned.
UBS has over 900 investment analysts from over 100 different countries.
Over 900 of the sharpest minds and freshest thinkers in the world of finance today.
To find out how we could help you,
contact us at ubs.com.
Let's continue today's programme now with today's newspapers. Joining me in the studio, I am delighted to say, getting herself comfortable, is Claudine Fry, partner at Control Risks and a regular voice around the table here. A very good morning to you, Claudine.
Good morning, Emma.
How's life in the Fry world?
It's very good, thank you.
Lots of busy risk analysis to get on with.
Oh, yes.
Your job must never, ever end. Let's have a look at the papers. What have you brought in? There's an article in the Financial Times that you want to draw our attention to in terms of the United Kingdom slashing its overseas aid budget.
Yes, in the United Kingdom, I think we're building up to big budget on the 30th of October. The build-up seems to have been going on forever. I think we'll all be relieved when we actually finally hear what's in it. But yes, this piece is about some anticipation ahead of that overseas development aid will hit a 17-year low this year, which is astonishing. That the UK government back in 2013 was a bit of a trailblazer in ring fencing a certain amount of GNI, 0.7%, to be spent on aid. That was later cut to 0.5% by Boris Johnson in 2021. But actually, ever since then, the amount of that aid budget spent overseas has been falling as we have been spending an increasing amount on humanitarian needs here in the UK, i.e. on supporting the needs of asylum seekers and refugees. And in a time of very, very intense pressure on public spending, there are fears that amount being spent domestically here in the UK of the overall aid budget is actually going to increase even further.
The irony is, and probably it's not been lost on the Labour government, because I think the Foreign Secretary David Lammy is trying to stop any kind of cut in overseas aid, is that the more you help overseas countries, the less likely it's been demonstrated that they will have people who wish to flee and seek asylum in the United Kingdom. I mean, how accurate an assessment is that? I mean, as you say, that was the line that we were told in 2013.
Yeah, and the UK government, the new government that we've had in place since July, has made much of the fact that it's resetting the UK's status globally, reconnecting with the world after a really bumpy decade with Brexit. But also our reputation has been hit by other things too, including the fact that we have cut aid. That has been perceived really poorly. So I think it is a moment for us to really demonstrate, if we do want to be reconnecting with the world and establishing a different kind of global status for the UK for sort of the times that we're living in, one way to do that would be to be supporting development around the world.
OK, let's move on to a story in the Japan Times. This astonished me, actually. China is overtaking Europe as a top market for Russia's pipeline gas.
Yeah.
I thought sanctions were doing something here. Explain to us, tell us more about the context of this before we start to move to China.
Yeah. So China is, this is a piece in the Japan Times about the fact that China is about to overtake Europe as a top market for Russia's pipeline gas. As you say, yes, since the expansion of the war in Ukraine in 2022, there has been an explosion in the use of sanctions, which have been designed specifically to prevent Russia making money from its substantial oil and gas industry. But the fact is that Europe was very, very heavily dependent on Russia before 2022. In fact, we imported about 40% of total gas needs, for example, from Russia prior to the expansion of the war in 2022. And it was not possible to turn off the taps overnight. So some parts of the Russian oil and gas industry have been protected from sanctions. And in fact, some parts of Europe, particularly Hungary and Slovakia, for example, remain very much dependent on exports from Russia. So there are still sources of energy that parts of Europe are dependent on, which come directly from Russia.
So China now, according to the Japan Times, will be the largest market for Russia's pipeline gas. What does this mean for Russia's, pivoting not only politically, but in terms of where it sells its energy?
Yeah, so Russia has been arguably surprisingly resilient in the face of sanctions that have been imposed on it over the last couple of years. And part of the reason for that is that it's been able to depend on alternative customers for its oil and gas. China has been a really important one, but India has as well, of course. Both of those countries have increased substantially the amount of energy that they import from Russia, and that is going to continue to be the case.
What does this mean for Russia's finances? Because it needs as much money as it can, not least to fund its war in Ukraine.
Yes, it's been a really important source of revenue for Russia. Russia is essentially operating a war economy now. So there are significant issues with that and very serious sources of weakness. But it has been surprisingly resilient. And, there are question marks around how long that could be sustained. But certainly it seems to be able to depend on support from overseas, particularly from trading partners in Asia, which is not under any serious threat.
Let's move to an article in The Guardian that you wanted to talk to us about, AI.
Yeah, this is the piece that's on the front page of The Guardian here in the UK today, and it's reporting on the latest attempt by the creative industry to take action against what they perceive to be threats to their rights by the development of AI. So this is a statement that has been signed by over 10,000 artists, ranging from photographers to authors to musicians, which is condemning the unlicensed use of their work for training generative AI and describing the use of their work in this manner as a major unjust threat.
What does that mean?
So as the organiser of the statement, the British composer and former AI executive, as he's described in the piece, Ed Newton-Rex, says, he points out that there are three key sources that generative AI companies need to build AI: people, computer and data. People, computers and data. And at the moment, the people don't tend to be paid anywhere near as much as the AI companies are paying for engineers and for data. So I think that's a really interesting insight into what we value as societies and how we want to play that going forward as we incorporate AI into our lives more and more.
Does this seem a sort of an inevitability? I mean, we've seen strikes in Hollywood over the use of AI to replace the creativity of the human being. But is there a sense that actually this is happening already?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, Emma. As you mentioned, this is just the latest in a long line of sort of tactics, moves made by the creative industry. We had the actors' strike last year, of course, and there was an agreement that the Actors Union reached last year that drew that strike to a close, which saw some concessions being made to the creative industry from tech companies around actors' rights to their images and their voices being used. So I think we will see. From time to time, we will see the power of the tech industry being constrained and creatives winning some concessions. But overall, yes, I think AI is going in a certain direction. And actually, we have seen some musicians embracing AI and even using it and inviting fans to use it to do new versions of their tracks. So we're seeing different attitudes in different parts of the creative industry. So I think we're feeling our way. I think in all sectors there's a huge amount of debate and uncertainty as we work out what the legal and ethical implications of AI are for us all. But yes, I think fundamentally it's going in one direction.
Finally, speaking of one direction, very briefly, a woman. We like our phones, right? It is important to be connected to your phone. So important for one Australian woman that she dropped her phone between two boulders when she was out walking and got stuck trying to retrieve it upside down.
Oh, isn't that just awful? Yes, this is a piece that's in a few different papers around the world today.
And there's a brilliant picture of her feet.
Brilliant picture. I was going to say, hunt it out and have a look at the picture because it's extraordinary. Yes, this poor lady out hiking with her friends in the Hunter Valley in Australia, which sounds absolutely lush and beautiful. I've not been there myself. But there she was trying to grab her phone as it had fallen down between a couple of boulders, and she went with it in the end, got stuck for 7 hours dangling upside down, waiting to be rescued. But she was miraculously rescued with actually very little in terms of sort of impact to her health and body as a consequence. But she is warning us all that and reminding us all that really, it's not worth risking our lives for our phones.
Luckily, she had friends who could ring for help when she got stuck. Claudine Fry, thank you so much for joining us in the studio. The time here in London is 7:32 a.m. Let's have a look at what else we're keeping an eye on today. Donald Trump's presidential campaign has filed a legal complaint against Britain's governing Labour Party, accusing it of interfering in the US election. In a statement with the heading "The British Are Coming," the former president's team accused Labour of inspiring what it called Kamala Harris's dangerously liberal policies by travelling to the US to campaign for the Democrats. Labour officials say they do so in a personal capacity. Ukraine's prosecutor general has resigned following a scandal in which dozens of officials reportedly abused their position to receive disability status and avoid military service. Andrei Kostin's resignation follows a meeting of the National Security and Defence Council where officials discussed how to crack down on corruption. The German Chancellor Olaf Scholz is leading a high-level delegation to New Delhi this week in the hope that greater access to the vast Indian market can reduce Germany's reliance on China. German direct investments in India were around $27 billion in 2022. That's about 20% of the volume invested in China. And one of the world's richest people, Bill Gates, has reportedly donated about $50 million to a non-profit organisation that supports Kamala Harris's presidential bid. According to the New York Times, the Microsoft founder doesn't explicitly acknowledge the donation. However, in a statement, he says, "I have a long history of working with leaders across the political spectrum, but this election is different, with unprecedented significance for Americans and the most vulnerable people around the world." This is The Globalist. Stay tuned. 7:34 here in London. Now, the former president of Peru has been jailed for 2 decades after being convicted of taking bribes from a Brazilian construction company. Prosecutors claim that Alejandro Toledo received more than $35 million from the company, which then won a contract to build a road in southern Peru. Well, Natalia Sobrevilla Perea is Professor of Latin American History at the University of Kent. A very good morning to you, Natalia.
Good morning, Emma.
This has been a long story. It's 5 years since he was arrested in the States.
Yes, it's been a long time coming.
So explain to us what's happened and what he was accused of.
Alejandro Toledo was accused of taking bribes from the construction company Odebrecht in Brazil for the construction of a road between Peru and Brazil, the Interoceanica. And many people around him who helped him hide the bribes collaborated with the Peruvian government, and there was no surprise that he was convicted.
Just tell us a little bit more about the fact that this is a Brazilian construction company, and it absolutely fits in with Operation Car Wash, which was an anti-corruption drive which began in Brazil. So just explain to us the wider context and how the former president of Peru managed to get himself tied up in that.
Well, Odebrecht operated around the continent, and it was a very important construction company, and they ensured that they would win all the bids by paying extraordinary bribes to people in power. And Alejandro Toledo is just one of many presidents of Peru accused of participating in this huge scandal. Let's not forget that Alan Garcia, former president of Peru, committed suicide when he was also in the process of being tried on this very same issue.
Tell us a little bit more about the damage that this does. Because of Toledo's background, he was elected by beating Alberto Fujimori and bringing dignity to the country and restoring. I mean, his campaign when he was elected was to get rid of corruption and to actually offer a clean slate to Peru. So how much is his conviction an enormous wound to that?
I think one of the greatest tragedies of Alejandro Toledo was that he came to be seen as the hero of Peru's democracy in the early 2000s. He campaigned against Fujimori in 95, in 2000, where Fujimori was cheating, and then eventually he won in 2001, and his whole campaign was based on this idea that he wanted to bring back democracy and end with corruption. Now, the big sad part of this is that he did return democracy, but the corrupt basis of the Fujimori regime was maintained throughout Toledo's, and he proved to Peruvians that it didn't matter that it was democracy or dictatorship, but corruption was the only way to govern. And I think this has been one of those pervasive things and pernicious things to come from this.
There is a tendency, if you spot it now, that Peru likes to lock up its leaders. We have former President Pablo Kaczynski is being investigated for alleged money laundering. Alan Garcia, who followed Toledo, killed himself when police came to arrest him at his home. What is it about Peruvian leaders who start as nobly as the likes of Toledo, but end up getting their fingers burned?
Well, because the whole system that Fujimori created, and in fact, Alan Garcia in his first bid as president also put in place, was extremely corrupt. Now, what's paradoxical is that on one side, there is the ability to be corrupt and to steal a lot of money. And on the other hand, the justice system will eventually get all the presidents. In fact, everybody's waiting for Dina Boluarte to finish her time in power, only for her to end up in jail.
Natalia Sobrevilla Perea, thank you so much for joining us on Monocle Radio. 9:39 a.m. in Cairo, 8:39 a.m. in Zurich. You're back with The Globalist. Now, Egypt has been certified as being a nation free of malaria. It follows nearly a century of work to try to rid the country of the disease. To tell us more, I'm delighted to say Dr. Chris Smith, host of the Naked Scientist podcast and virologist at Cambridge University, joins me now. Very good morning to you, Chris. Welcome back.
Good morning.
So tell us about the Egyptians. How did they do it?
Well, this is, as some are dubbing it, a century-old struggle, but in fact it goes back far longer than that. We've got documented evidence that even the pharaohs were victims, Tutankhamun himself, of malaria. Unsurprisingly, really, this is a disease that's endemic to that part of the world, and thrives where there's a lot of water. Egypt, Cairo specifically, sits on the Nile. There was a lot of crop cultivation, rice cultivation, and a high population. And all of those things are the ingredients for an endemic disease to take hold. The cycle with malaria is you need a certain species of mosquito, the anopheline mosquitoes. You need people that are infected with malaria, and you need people who are susceptible to getting malaria, or they have behaviours that mean that they are in contact with those mosquitoes that are carrying malaria. Once you have enough people who are infected, they can infect mosquitoes, and enough mosquitoes to infect more people. Then you have a chain of transmission, and then you've got an endemic infection. It's really hard to deal with that. And what Egypt have done is to really bear down on this over the last 100 years or so with a whole range of different manoeuvres that deal with each of those aspects that I just outlined and have broken the chain of transmission. They've now confirmed that for 3 years in a row, there has been no chain of transmission. This ticks the box for the World Health Organization's criterion for a country having eliminated malaria from its shores.
Just explain a little bit more the detail as to how that elimination took place. I mean, we've talked about malaria vaccines in certain areas, but as you said, malaria is as old as Egyptian civilization. There's there's traces of it in Tutankhamun. And, the cultivation of rice and wheat near residential areas was banned for a little while, but Egypt still has water, it still has cultivation of wheat and rice.
Yeah. So by attacking each of the aspects of the transmission chain, reducing where the mosquitoes are and where they can hang out, and one of the things that's actually helped, paradoxically, is an increase in population and urbanisation, because Anopheles mosquitoes do not like urban environments. They like aquatic or water-dominated open environments and swampy places. This is now not the case in Cairo. So this has made the mosquito less at home in Cairo. Making sure that fewer people have the infection by good public health manoeuvres. You know who's got the infection, you know where they are, and you can then treat them so that there are not cases lurking in the community to infect other mosquitoes. You also then bear down on other routes of the disease coming back in and reinfecting your country. And by doing all of these different manoeuvres, robbing the mosquito of a home, robbing the mosquito of an ability to get to the people, and treating the people swiftly, this helps to break that chain of transmission. And once you get it under a certain number of cases in the community, then it's much harder for it to regain a toehold. We used to have malaria in the UK, believe it or not, and on a number of occasions probably. Back in the Middle Ages, we had around Ely in the Fens, fen ague. This is an illness documented, but it bears a really striking resemblance to the symptoms of malaria. When they drained the fens and civilization improved its quality a bit, we stopped seeing case reports of this. So we think we probably had a form of malaria endemic to the UK then. And also after the First World War, the Kent marshes were an ideal home for malaria to take up temporary residence there when it was brought in by mass migrations of people back from the First World War. Again, various manoeuvres broke the chain of transmission and then it didn't re-establish. But it's a wake-up call. It shows how easily, and this is what lots of people, including the World Health Organization, are saying, it could easily come back, because just because you've kicked it out for now, if there's any opportunity afforded to these sorts of infections, they can re-establish themselves. And we're looking at other countries around Europe, for example, that now have the right conditions and the right mosquitoes to either host malaria or other diseases. And this is the other thing, that malaria is one thing, it's not the only trick in town. There are a number of other diseases, emerging infections that are becoming much more common, much more prevalent, and their ranges are expanding. Zika virus is one of them, but dengue is the other. And there are other things in other African countries that could also spread there too. So just because malaria has been dealt with, big problem, but there are other major infectious diseases that also transmit this way that are out there too.
I thought this story was too good to be true. And you was only waiting, Chris, for you to give us a warning about something else that could get us. But Because of this, the fact that obviously it has been around for so long in so many different places, how effective or how much in evidence is there a global approach to this?
Well, you're right. There's about 250 million cases of malaria every single year, and it probably kills between 500,000 and 1 million people a year, the majority of them young children, because they're particularly vulnerable, particularly if their mum caught malaria when she was pregnant. And this does things to the way the immune system is educated in these young infants, making them more susceptible to severe malaria. It's also a really big problem for women who are pregnant anyway, because the immune system is slightly downturned or turned down. It's one of those diseases that tends to be worst in places that are least well adapted and equipped to deal with it. So it's one of those diseases that tends to run rife in areas of poverty and areas of deprivation. And it's also the fact that most of the countries where that is the case tend to be in the perfect breeding zone for malaria mosquitoes. So it's a perfect storm. That's why there's an international effort to try to improve various aspects of those places, public health, how people protect themselves, robbing the mosquito of a home, etc. And by having all these measures, you can bring down the numbers of cases, and therefore you try to keep a handle on the disease. But with global warming, rising world population and population displacement through civil disorder, wars, and also climate change itself, this means it's a moving target, it's a moving goalpost. And so we can't take our eye off the ball.
Chris Smith, thank you so much for joining us, as ever, on Monocle Radio.
UBS is a global financial services firm with over 150 years of heritage. Built on the unique dedication of our people, we bring fresh thinking and perspective to our work. We know that it takes a marriage of intelligence and heart to create lasting value for our clients. It's about having the right ideas, of course, but also about having one of the most accomplished systems and an unrivaled network of global experts. That's why at UBS, we pride ourselves on thinking smarter to make a real difference. Tune in to The Bulletin with UBS every week for the latest insights and opinions from UBS all around the world.
Time to talk transport news. I'm delighted to say Christian Warmore, transport historian, author of Cathedrals and Steam, and basically the man who knows everything there is to know about transport, is in the studio. A very warm welcome.
Good morning.
How's life in the warm world? Have we
not too bad.
Been on any good trains
I've just
recently?
cycled round Regent's Park. Good fun.
Marvellous. Excellent. Two wheels. Let's talk about the glorious Shinkansen, something that often defines the brilliance of Japan. So famous, it made it to Brio. You know those little wooden train tracks that you get for your small children?
Yes.
We trod on a lot of Shinkansens in our house. Thankfully, that era has now passed. My feet are more comfortable, but Shinkansen is 60. I mean, how is that possible?
Yes, that's amazing. In fact, yes, there's lots of young children interested in this, because I mentioned this when I went to a football match yesterday with my mate, who said his grandson, who is about 8, is absolutely fascinated by Shinkansen. So it's an inspiration for children. And yes, it's just celebrated 60 years because it was inaugurated for the 1964 Olympics, and the first train ran in October 1964.
What makes us just fall to pieces with love for this thing?
Well, there is that iconic picture of the Shinkansen next to Mount Fuji with snow on it. And I think that is the kind of, one of the most famous kind of photographs ever. But also, look, it delivers everything. It gets you faster to different cities. It's very comfortable. It's got wonderful technology. So it's just a very attractive proposition and really revived train travel. It kind of meant that this 19th century invention had a 21st century future.
And not just that, it obviously went and set a very, very high standard for high-speed rail. I mean, how much is what Shinkansen did 60 years ago and arguably still does today, which has inspired other high-speed rail networks around the world?
Well, I mean, all of them. I mean, it took about 17 years before the French got one. And then it started expanding quite quickly. And So there's some surprising countries, like Spain has the biggest network in Europe. France, as I mentioned, Italy has quite a good network all the way down the spine. But then, of course, the big one is China. So Japan has 3,000 kilometers now. China is approaching 40,000 kilometers, and which is built in 30 years. And that is just the most extraordinary feat. And indeed, I'm writing a book about this, so I'm going to Japan in 2 or 3 weeks' time to actually see the Shinkansen for the first time in my life. And then I will be going to China later on also, because, you know, you can't write a book about high-speed rail without covering those two countries.
Absolutely, and we should look forward to your reports from there. Right, let's turn a corner, and not such a great situation in the United Kingdom in the last couple of days. We've had a rail crash, a low-speed rail crash that's that's resulted in someone dying.
Yes, indeed. This is in Wales on a line I know well, actually. It's a single-track line. And this was a classic autumn problem because it seems that one of the trains went through its virtual red light. It's a place where there aren't kind of actual signals outside, but it has a virtual red light, and it went through that and then smashed in, but only at about 25 kilometres an hour into another train. And although nobody was fatally killed in terms of the accident itself, a man did die of a heart attack as a result of this, you know, obviously out of shock. This is actually only the third fatal accident in 20 years on the British rail network. So, one can't be concerned about safety. It is still the safest form of travel, but it's a bit concerning that there have been 2 or 3 incidents like this where it's the autumn leaves. We joke about leaves on the line, but they actually do mean that rails are very slippery and the brakes might well not function.
When you get on a plane, what group are you?
I'm always the one who doesn't pay any extra for boarding passes, but apparently,
are we group 5?
Yes, whatever, the last one.
The last one. Or even all remaining passengers, please make their way to departure.
Absolutely. And I absolutely don't see the point of paying extra. But people do pay extra. And so American Airlines have introduced this thing of when you get your boarding pass scanned, if you're in the wrong queue, it sends you back out, humiliating you in front of all the other passengers. But my view is the whole thing is bonkers. And look, I have a completely different idea for this. Why don't they just board you in groups according to your seat number and just group people in the seat numbers and then board them in the right order? And so you'd board the people in the kind of furthest off seats first and then the other people and so on. It just seems completely logical that after 100 years of aviation, we haven't managed to get on the plane in any coherent way. Instead, we use this ridiculous technology.
I did read somewhere that they were almost thinking of asking you to board depending on where your seat was, not in terms of row, but whether you were aisle, middle, or window. But that assumes that you're only ever travelling by yourself, as does this thing. It seems that, let's say your other half has luckily managed to wriggle their way up to Group 1, and yet you're down at the back. How does that work?
Well, you go together. But yes, no, that is such a sensible idea. You put the window seat people in first, and it would speed things up enormously. And it's surprising that some of the low-cost airlines like Ryanair, which is always in a hurry to get you back, should not have thought of that.
Christian Woolmore, thank you so much for joining us in the studio. You're listening to The Globalist on Monocle Radio. We head to Rome now, which is playing host to the 19th iteration of its film festival. And Monocle's Lily Austin has been going to the festival for us, and I'm delighted to say she joins us from the Italian capital. A very good morning to you. How's Rome looking this morning, Lily?
Ciao, Emma. It's very sunny, very warm, apparently unseasonably warm this year, but which I think the locals are very concerned about, but I've really been enjoying it, I have to admit.
Indeed, and it's one of those things that actually is probably not the best situation if you're trying to go and watch a lot of films. Tell us a little bit about which films are sort of getting people excited.
Well, the big one was the opening of André Segre's Berliner, the Great Ambitioner, which is a biopic about the Communist Party secretary Enrico Berlinguer, and that has had a lot of excitement about it. He's a huge political figure here in Italy, so everyone was very excited about this film coming out because he's an interesting man in that apparently he's beloved on both the right and left of politics, even to this day. Giorgia Meloni has apparently recently went to an exhibition about him, and yeah, so that film has been causing a lot of fuss. And then, of course, Francis Ford Coppola kind of opened the festival with a screening of Megalopolis. So that has, of course, it continues to make waves, both positive and negative reviews. But that was a big pull for the festival this year, having him there.
Let's talk about Berlinguer, The Great Ambition. Like you say, it's one of Italy's most well-known politicians. It's a biopic. One wonders, is this, I mean, having seen it, would you suggest that this is something that is for an Italian audience, or is it someone who doesn't know anything about Berlinguer would actually find a real amount of pleasure from it?
Yeah, I think so. It's he has an incredible story. I mean, even I don't really, not to spoil it, but he has a kind of shocking end to his life. He was making a speech on stage, and whilst that happened, got kind of a bleed in his head and died a few days later. So he has this, like, from the start of his career right to the end, it was a very eventful life. So I think it's actually quite a good entry point for people who don't know so much about Italian politics to see a film like this. So I definitely, it's a film that's tipped for distribution abroad, possibly just on streaming, but I think that will be definitely one that will be interesting for people outside of Italy as well as inside.
Okay, there was a chuckle in your voice when you mentioned Megalopolis. How's it going down in Rome?
Speaking to, it's kind of the film everyone's talking about. Yesterday I was talking to a couple of filmmakers at the festival, and yeah, generally a lot of astonishment about this film, a lot of confusion, but I mean, I think grand folly is always the best kind of films. If you're going to do a film that's like bizarre and strange, even if it maybe isn't always pulled off, like, it's great to just kind of go for it. So I think mixed reviews for sure, but it's definitely causing a lot of buzz.
Finally, talk about the Italian film industry. Countries bend over backwards for tax incentives to attract filmmakers to their country. Where does Italy sit at the moment with this?
Yeah, this is a big topic for everyone at the festival. I think it's been a big topic at most. It was the same at Cannes and in Venice a couple of months ago, because there's been this long-planned change to the tax rules in Italy that the former culture minister, Gennaro San Giuliano, had planned. And then he was involved in a scandal and had to be and was removed. And now the new culture minister, Alessandro Giuli, hasn't said anything about it, but there are these rumors that they're going to change these tax incentives, like make it much more difficult to get tax breaks for production companies coming into Italy, and also have new rules about the film needs to be a certain level of Italianness in order to get funding. So especially for filmmakers who are making smaller and middle level films, there's a lot of concern about whether or not their films next year are going to get the same opportunities that they have in the last couple of years.
Monocle's Lily Austin, thank you for joining us on the line from Rome. And that's all the time we have for today's programme. The warmest of thanks to all my guests and to our producers too, Vincent McAviney, Chris Chermak, Hassan Anderson and Fernanda Augusta Pacheco. Our researcher is Sana Jumani and our studio manager is Flynn Simons. After the headlines, more music on the way. The briefing's live at midday here in London, and The Globalist is back at the same time tomorrow. I hope you can join me for that if you can. But for now, from me, Emma Nelson, goodbye. Thank you very much for listening.